They dragged him like a dead animal, his face unrecognizable, his body battered to a pulp. They hung him upside down in a public square while the crowd spat on his corpse. This was the end of Benito Mussolini, the man who promised to restore Italy's greatness, but met a fate more brutal than any enemy. For more than 2 decades he ruled with an iron fist, signed pacts with Hitler, and built an empire based on terror. But when war caught up with him, his world collapsed. Abandoned, disguised, captured like a criminal, he begged for his life. But no one listened. He was executed without trial, without mercy, without remorse. But the most shocking part was not his death. It was what they did to his body. Why did the crowd unleash its fury on a corpse? What atrocities did he suffer even after death? And what was the sinister final fate of his remains? The rise of fascism, from ideology to power. A decade before Hitler came to power, when Franco was still an unknown colonel and Europe was largely composed of democratic republics, one man had conceived a totalitarian dictatorship that would rival the glory of the Roman Empire. Benito Mussolini would become the supreme leader of Italy in 1923, imposing features that would later be adopted by other authoritarian states. The detention of opponents in concentration camps, a secret police force monitoring the population, a vast propaganda apparatus, and a personality cult centered around a strong leader. Benito Mussolini rose to national prominence in 1912 as the leader of the radical wing of the Italian Socialist Party, opposing the war in Libya. At first, he defended Italian neutrality in the Great War, but his political ideas gradually evolved toward the far right, convinced that Italy needed a fundamental change in government. However, Mussolini never lost his disdain for political and business establishments. Influenced by revolutionary syndicalists, he became convinced that nationalism could create a movement capable of dismantling bourgeois liberalism and forging a new Italy. After the catastrophic defeat in World War I, Italians were furious with the management of the campaign and demanded change. Mussolini seized this moment and founded his Fascio di Combattimento in Milan on March 23, 1919. This new political movement recruited ex-soldiers, syndicalists, and futurists. Its program combined nationalism with republicanism, anti-clericalism, women's suffrage, and social reform. The central idea of fascism was the mobilization of men and women, workers and employers, peasants and landowners into a unified national community. The key to achieving this, according to Mussolini, was violence. The fascist squads, or squadristi, launched a violent campaign of intimidation against Catholics and socialists, causing hundreds of deaths. By 1922, the fascists had effectively taken control of law and order in many rural areas. They also fought against Slavic minorities in the Venice region and expanded into the cities, where they helped break a general strike in July 1922. By the end of that year, fascism had 250,000 members. The fascists adopted symbols heavily influenced by ancient Rome, as Mussolini claimed his mission was to restore Italy's former glory when it was the most powerful empire in the world. While Hitler used the swastika, an ancient Indian symbol, Mussolini chose the fasces, an axe wrapped in wooden rods that in ancient Rome symbolized a king's power to punish his subjects. The black shirts worn by his paramilitary militia would become synonymous with senseless political violence. Mussolini's political vision was deeply rooted in the concept of a totalitarian state where the individual completely submits to the will of the leader and the nation. Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, Mussolini proclaimed, articulating a vision that would absorb every aspect of civil and individual life under the centralized control of the fascist government. This political doctrine found its practical expression in the systematic suppression of independent unions, opposition political parties, and the free press, replacing them with structures controlled by the regime. With only 35 seats in parliament after the 1921 elections, fascism was not yet one of the main political forces. But Mussolini believed he didn't really need votes. He could seize power through a combination of pressure from the streets and support from the country's business, agricultural, and political elites. In the summer of 1922, fascist pressure to take power intensified, and by autumn plans for a march on Rome had been drawn up. Italian governments struggled to contain fascist violence, underestimating the threat they posed. Moreover, in many areas, local authorities either turned a blind eye or even assisted fascist violence. The lack of decisive action only emboldened the fascists, who were able to carry out mass occupations in multiple cities and towns. Finally, between October 2nd and 3rd, 1922, the fascists occupied Bolzano and Trento and effectively took control of the local administration. Once again, the government did nothing to stop them, convincing Mussolini that perhaps it was possible to take Rome directly. On October 24, 1922, Mussolini spoke before an enthusiastic audience of 60,000 people, mostly blackshirts, in Naples. He described the foundational myth of a new Rome, awakened after thousands of years of slumber. He declared that they, the fascists, had the right to rule the country in the absence of a more suitable government. After his speech, he met secretly with some of his lieutenants and carefully planned the march on Rome. Interestingly, he did not personally participate in the march but followed it from his headquarters in Milan, arriving in Rome later once the fascists had reached the city. Column after column of fierce men in black shirts covered the distance to the seat of power, effectively flooding Rome's main squares without resistance. Though impressive, with up to 30,000 black shirts, the march was more a show of force than a conquest. Meanwhile, the shrewd Mussolini was negotiating directly with the King of Italy regarding his appointment as head of state. After the march on Rome on October 30th, the king had no choice but to hand over power to Mussolini, who had the support of the military, the business class, and the right wing. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearful of a civil war and pressured by generals who sympathized with the fascists, capitulated to Mussolini, appointing him prime minister. The new leader arrived in Rome wearing a tailcoat, not the black shirt of his movement. A symbolic change meant to reassure conservatives that he was a statesman, not a revolutionary. However, this facade of constitutional legitimacy would soon fade as Mussolini began systematically dismantling Italy's democratic institutions. From that moment on, and for the next 21 years, Mussolini would become the sole leader of the nation. The machinery of terror, political repression, and racial persecution. One of the few places where fascism still faced opposition was Turin. A few months after the march on Rome, Mussolini's blackshirts carried out one of the worst massacres in Italian history. On the night of December 17th to 18th, 1922, a communist militant killed 2 fascists in Turin, triggering a disproportionate and bloody revenge. That same night, Mussolini's troops stormed and set fire to the local union headquarters and attacked 2 clubs owned by the Italian Socialist Party. This was followed by the complete destruction of the communist newspaper L'Ordine Nuovo, edited by Antonio Gramsci. The editors were taken to Turin's Central Park and threatened with execution. The armed fascists rounded up communists and trade unionists in the city and executed several of them in horrific ways. Some were beaten to death. The death of anarchist worker and unionist Pietro Ferrero was particularly harrowing. After being tortured, the fascists tied him to a truck and dragged him, still alive, at full speed down Corso Vittorio Emanuele, laughing and singing as they went. His corpse was dumped at the foot of the statue of King Victor Emmanuel II. When the local police found his body, it was so disfigured that they could only identify him by a document in one of his pockets. Despite being a minority in parliament, few senators or deputies dared to speak out against the fascists, fearing they would suffer the same violence as in Turin. One of the few who openly denounced them was Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist deputy elected in 1919. He even published a book in 1924 titled The Fascists Exposed, A Year of Fascist Rule, which would seal his fate. On June 10, 1924, Matteotti suddenly disappeared. He was about to speak before the Chamber of Deputies, revealing corruption involving the National Fascist Party and Sinclair Oil to obtain funds for fascist propaganda. One of those implicated was Mussolini's own brother Arnaldo. 2 months later, his beaten and decomposed body was found in Riano, 23 kilometers from where he was last seen. Matteotti had been kidnapped in the street and forced into an unmarked car. He attempted to escape but was chased down and repeatedly stabbed with a carpenter's file. According to forensic analysis, he died shortly after his abduction. 5 men, all blackshirts, were arrested days later. Only 3 were convicted, but they were soon released under an amnesty granted by King Victor Emmanuel III. The Matteotti case was the most challenging test for the fascist government due to the severity of its violence and the impunity with which the perpetrators acted. The Italian public and the international community were shocked by such a blatant murder. For a brief moment, it seemed that the fascist regime might collapse under public outrage. But Mussolini skillfully maneuvered, denying any direct involvement in the killing, while simultaneously consolidating his control over the state apparatus. In the end, the case proved that both the police and the king, as well as the Italian bourgeoisie, were willing to support Mussolini. Another consequence was that anti-fascist deputies and senators began abandoning parliament, recognizing the futility of opposing a party with total power and the brute force to enforce it. However, there was resistance within the fascist party itself. During the fall of 1924, the party's extremist wing threatened Mussolini with a coup. 3 days after a confrontation on New Year's Eve, Mussolini delivered a famous speech attacking both the anti-fascists and asserting that he and he alone was the leader of fascism. He admitted that all the violence was his responsibility because he had created a climate in which it thrived. He concluded with a warning to all Italians: the country needed stability, and only fascism could ensure it by any means necessary. This speech marked the true beginning of dictatorship in Italy. One of the tools of repression perfected during the fascist years was Italy's secret police known as OVA, founded in 1927, 6 years before the Gestapo in Germany. OVA was the direct precursor and model for Himmler's Gestapo. Himmler himself met several times with OVA leaders while the Gestapo was being formed. In 1936, a secret protocol was signed between both organizations for collaboration and cooperation. OVA's operational record was staggering. It maintained individual files on approximately 130,000 potential subversives and, at its peak, controlled a network of about 100,000 informants. By 1930, OVA was conducting around 20,000 weekly raids, primarily targeting communists and members of opposition parties. Approximately 6,000 people were arrested by OVA, and those found guilty of conspiring against the fascist government were exiled to remote Mediterranean islands. Conditions in these places were extremely poor. So many anti-fascists preferred to leave Italy altogether. OVA was infamous for installing hidden microphones in public places to eavesdrop on conversations and gauge public sentiment. Its primary goal was to detect and suppress any anti-fascist activity or sentiment. Its reach extended far beyond domestic surveillance. OVA maintained a presence in many countries, targeting Italian exiles and anti-fascist activists abroad. One of the most notorious assassinations attributed to OVA operatives was that of Carlo Rosselli and his brother Nello in 1937. On June 9th, Carlo and Nello Rosselli, who had fought in Spain, were visiting the coast of Normandy in France. A year earlier, OVA had labeled Carlo as the most dangerous of the exiled socialists and recommended his elimination. Thanks to its extensive network across Europe, OVA was able to instruct French fascists to carry out the murder. Rosselli's funeral was massive, with an estimated crowd of 150,000 left-wing supporters saluting Carlo's body as it was taken to Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris. When Mussolini ordered the creation of OVA, its primary target was the Communist Party, but it also included socialists, Republicans, and anyone considered anti-fascist. Its surveillance was ruthless, intense, and intrusive. Even those loosely connected to subversive activities, such as family members, could become entangled in police investigations. Local police sometimes collaborated with OVA, valuing its methods of threats, assaults, and torture against detainees. Once the opposition was subdued, OVA shifted its focus to using its network to gauge public opinion about the regime and its war plans. A dedicated office routinely listened to thousands of phone calls, including those of fascist leaders, to verify their loyalties. By the early 1930s, circumstances in Europe had changed significantly. The rise of Hitler and the Nazis to power in Germany fundamentally altered the European order. Mussolini now had a powerful ideological ally, which opened up opportunities for him but also posed challenges to his status as the leader of the fascist world. However, there were many differences between fascist and Nazi ideologies, particularly regarding racial purity and the treatment of Jews. Until the 1930s, Mussolini's nationalism did not have a significantly racist component, though it was anti-Semitic. In 1932, Mussolini told journalist Emil Ludwig that he did not support the concept of a pure race, adding that he celebrated the racial mixtures that had given Italians their strength and beauty. In that interview, he also spoke positively about Jews as Italian citizens. Fascism supported the coexistence of Jewish identity and Italian patriotism. In April 1937, Mussolini stated in an interview that he didn't accept Nazi racial theories. However, in September 1938, the Italian Council of Ministers passed legislation that extensively stripped Jews of their rights, established state agencies to oppress them, and adopted Aryanization policies. The adoption of anti-Semitic laws reflected the growing influence of Nazi Germany over Italy and Mussolini's decision to align his regime more closely with Hitler's. This transition was a significant betrayal of thousands of Italian Jews who had been loyal to the fascist regime, with many even serving in its ranks. The Italian Jewish community, one of the oldest in Europe with roots dating back to Roman times, suddenly found itself marginalized and persecuted by a regime many had previously supported. From the passage of the 1938 racial laws until the end of World War II, Jewish Italian citizens were excluded from major areas of civic and economic life. They were no longer allowed to attend schools, be recruited into the military, own businesses, oversee land, or hire non-Jewish employees. They were also banned from working in public administration, banks, insurance companies, newspapers, publishing houses, or educational institutions. Marriage between Jews and Aryan Italians was prohibited. Foreign Jews were to be deported, though this measure proved difficult to enforce. In 1940, Mussolini attempted to impose an Aryanization of Italy by expelling all foreign Jews, but World War II made emigration impossible. The alternative turned out to be far worse as Jews began to be interned in forced labor camps. Fascist Italy had concentration camps long before the racial laws. The use of mandatory internment as a means of political and social control, organized by the police without recourse to courts, became part of government security measures in 1926. During Mussolini's regime, 15,000 Italians were sentenced to political confinement and 25,000 to common confinement. Most were sent to remote islands, though isolated villages in southern Italy were also used. In general, the conditions endured by internees were horrific, and the living conditions were unsanitary. Security was not provided by regular police but by blackshirts, who regularly subjected prisoners to brutal beatings and torture. By 1927, the government had created an effective concentration camp system capable of imprisoning thousands of citizens. Unlike in other countries, Italy had two types of camps, one designed specifically for repression and another supposedly meant to protect detainees. The internees of the first type were Slovenes, Croats, Montenegrins, Albanians, Greeks, Ethiopians, and Libyans. Living conditions were appalling: insufficient food, inadequate shelter, and often non-existent medical facilities. Tens of thousands died from disease and malnutrition, buried in unmarked mass graves. Paradoxically, the second type of camp ended up saving thousands of non-Italian Jews, as being interned in an Italian camp meant they were out of reach of the German army and the Croatian Ustasha. By the late 1930s, Mussolini had completely transformed the Italian state. What had once been a constitutional monarchy with a democratic parliament had become a totalitarian state where individual freedoms were sacrificed in the name of national greatness. Public education had become a vehicle for fascist indoctrination, teaching Italian children to revere the Duce and prepare for a life of military service and sacrifice. The media was entirely controlled by the state, broadcasting only regime-approved news and glorifying Mussolini's achievements. Industry was increasingly nationalized and geared toward military production, while dissent had become virtually impossible under Oviera's constant surveillance. Italy was ready for war, though its infrastructure and military capacity were far from adequate for the coming conflict. Expansion and atrocities from Africa to Europe. The invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935 is widely seen as one of the events that led to World War II, undermining the credibility of the League of Nations. Under the powerless gaze of the international community, Mussolini's armies advanced to the capital, Addis Ababa, in May 1936, forcing Emperor Haile Selassie into exile. But Ethiopia was far from conquered. The Italians faced fierce opposition from the Arbegnok, or patriots, Ethiopians from all classes and regions. In the years that followed, they waged a relentless guerrilla campaign against the fascist forces, aided by clandestine networks. This war of attrition was exceptionally brutal, marked by Italian reprisals, mass executions, house burnings, and the destruction of crops and livestock. A date still remembered in Africa as the bloodiest of the Italian occupation is Yekatit 12, February 19, 1937. On that day, rebels attempted to assassinate Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, Viceroy of Italian East Africa. Graziani was operated on and survived. He immediately ordered a harsh reprisal. Federal Secretary Guido Cortese gave his troops 3 days to do whatever they wished to Ethiopian rebels. During those days, Italians killed Ethiopians with daggers and clubs while chanting, "Duce! Duce!" They doused houses with gasoline and set them ablaze with people inside. They entered the homes of local Greeks and Armenians, killing their servants. Some even posed for photographs over the corpses. In just 3 days, the Italians killed between 1,400 and 30,000 Ethiopians in Addis Ababa alone. Estimates vary widely. Ethiopian sources claimed 30,000 dead, while other estimates range between 1,400 and 6,000. A recent study convincingly placed the number at approximately 19,200, representing 20% of Addis Ababa's population. In the following week, numerous Ethiopians suspected of opposition were arrested and executed, including members of the Black Lions resistance group and the aristocracy. They were shot, beheaded, or burned alive. In the spring of 1939, Italian forces used mustard gas to flush out Ethiopian resistance fighters, their families, and civilians who had taken refuge in a cave now known as Ametsegna Washa, Cave of the Rebels. On April 8th, the chemical unit of the 65th Infantry Division arrived with arsine shells and 200 kilograms of mustard gas. Chemical weapons had been banned under the 1925 Geneva Protocol, to which Italy was a signatory. At dawn on April 9th, Ethiopians inside the cave saw cylindrical objects lowered by ropes at the entrance. They heard explosions and gunfire. The containers were punctured, releasing thick clouds of yellowish smoke and vapor, killing everyone inside in excruciating agony. The use of chemical weapons in Ethiopia was a particularly alarming precursor to the war that was about to unfold in Europe. Mussolini had explicitly authorized their use, ignoring international treaties to demonstrate Italian technological and military supremacy. This willingness to employ prohibited and cruel methods against civilian populations illustrates the fascist ideology, which prioritized power and domination over humanitarian or legal considerations. The Ethiopians trapped in the cave had no defense against this invisible lethal weapon. They died in agony, their bodies convulsing as the gas attacked their lungs, eyes, and skin. It was a calculated act of barbarism that terrorized the local population and sent a clear message about the nature of Italian colonial rule. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in July 1936, Mussolini assured Franco of his full support. 3 divisions of black-shirt volunteers, nearly 75,000 men, were sent. They called themselves Dios lo quiere, God wills it, Las Llamas Negras, the Black Flames, and Las Plumas Negras, the Black Feathers. Despite their symbolic names, they lacked combat experience and were defeated in Guadalajara. The most significant support came from the Italian Air Force, which was sent to bomb innocent cities and instill fear. These acts were immortalized in Picasso's Guernica, which captures the anguish of civilians slaughtered as German and Italian planes bombed the Basque town. The number of victims remains disputed. The Basque government reported 1,654 dead. Few Italian air operations targeted military objectives. Most, like Guernica, were intended to break morale in Republican-held areas. This included the bombings of Alicante, Durango, Granollers, and Barcelona. Between March 16th and 18th, 1938, Barcelona was bombed by the Italian Air Force from Mallorca. They dropped 44 tons of bombs, targeting industrial and residential areas with no regard for civilian lives. It is considered the first carpet bombing in history. The attack killed 1,300 civilians, with thousands more injured or left homeless. The bombing of Barcelona was particularly terrifying because of its indiscriminate nature. Italian planes flew in formation over the densely populated city, dropping bombs randomly on apartment buildings, schools, markets, and hospitals. Sirens wailed as civilians desperately ran for makeshift air raid shelters, many never making it in time. The bombs demolished entire buildings, leaving rubble and bodies buried beneath the wreckage. Rescue teams worked for days to retrieve the dead and wounded, while the psychological impact, the deliberate terror caused by the attack, achieved exactly what Mussolini intended: to showcase the destructive power of his air force and the vulnerability of those who opposed fascism. Before leaving Spain following Franco's victory in 1939, the Italian Air Force had carried out 728 raids on Mediterranean cities, dropped 16,558 bombs, and caused 5,000 casualties, mostly civilians. Mussolini considered the air support a total success, but when his outdated planes entered World War II in 1940, they were quickly shot down by the far superior Royal Air Force. The intervention in Spain served as a testing ground for the tactics and weapons that would later be used in World War II. For Mussolini, it was also an opportunity to demonstrate solidarity with other fascist and anti-communist regimes, strengthening the network of authoritarian states that would eventually form the Axis. The suffering of Spanish civilians was incidental to him. What mattered was projecting power and strengthening ties with Hitler's Germany. Franco's victory was celebrated in Rome as proof of fascism's growing power, though it had come at a terrible human cost. Masculinity and violence were central to Mussolini's ideology and propaganda, and these principles were ruthlessly applied in Italy's campaigns during World War II. In 1940, Mussolini finally signed a treaty with Nazi Germany, officially making the two authoritarian nations allies. During this time, after the conquest of Ethiopia, Libya, and later Croatia, Mussolini proclaimed that Italy was once again an empire, just as it had been in Roman times. Italian citizens were encouraged to settle in the occupied territories. Around 150,000 settlers moved to Libya and 165,000 to Italian East Africa. Fascist Italian policies in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe provoked resistance, leading to the formation of partisan militias in some areas of Yugoslavia. In response, the Italians adopted brutal tactics, including summary executions, internments, property confiscation, and village burnings. The Italian government sent tens of thousands of civilians, including many women and children, to concentration camps. Among them were 30,000 Slovenes and 80,000 Dalmatians, representing 12% of the total population in that Croatian region. The mechanism behind the massacres committed by Italian forces during fascism, whether in Europe or Africa, was always the same. Whenever some of their agents were killed by rebels or local partisans, they retaliated with extreme force, killing hundreds or even thousands, raping women and kidnapping children. Such was the case in the small village of Podum, which was absorbed into the Italian province of Fiume in 1941. The regional prefect was the black-shirt Colonel Temistocle Testa, known for his threats of severe retaliation against those who refused to collaborate with the Italian forces. In the neighboring village of Jelenia in 1942, Testa ordered the execution of 34 innocent villagers. Later that year, he unleashed his fury on Podum as revenge for the deaths of 4 Italian citizens in June. On the morning of July 12, 1942, 250 Italian soldiers from the 2nd Blackshirt Battalion Emiliano, under the command of Major Armando Giorleo, entered Podum, rounding up all men of military age between 16 and 64 years old. They found 91 of them. 14 resisted arrest and were executed on the spot. The rest were taken to an open field south of the village. At the center was a dirt pit, though it is unclear whether it had already been there or was dug that same day. In groups of 5, all captives were led to the edge of the pit and shot so that their bound bodies would fall inside. Around 20 groups were slaughtered in cold blood, bringing the total number of victims to over 100. Despite the cruelty shown toward unarmed men and boys, fascist military commanders were not particularly skilled at waging war. Italy's entry into World War II in June 1940 quickly exposed the deep military weaknesses of Mussolini's regime. Il Duce had boasted for years about the strength and modernity of the Italian armed forces, but the reality was quite different. Equipment was outdated, strategy was poor, and troop morale was far from enthusiastic. Italy's early campaigns in North Africa and Greece ended in humiliating defeats, forcing Hitler to divert valuable resources to rescue his struggling ally. Defeated in all major battles, the Italian government had no choice but to sign an armistice with the Allies on September 3, 1943. Only then would the so-called Aryan Italian citizens experience what Jews, Ethiopians, Libyans and Croats had endured for years. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily, prompting King Victor Emmanuel III to depose Mussolini on the 25th. Later that year, after the king signed the armistice, the German army invaded northern and central Italy, bringing the war to Italian soil. Over the next 2 years, more than 150,000 Italian civilians would die in the crossfire. The new occupiers also brought their own cruelty, perpetrating several massacres against their former allies. In the small village of Marzabotto near Bologna, the Waffen-SS carried out the largest mass shooting in Italian history, killing nearly 800 civilians. Among the victims, 155 were under the age of 10 and 316 were women. All were completely innocent, guilty only of being Italian and living in Marzabotto. The collapse of the regime and the Republic of Salù. When Italy failed to hold back the Allied armies during World War II, Mussolini desperately sought help from his ally, Hitler. On July 19, 1943, he met with the Führer in Feltre, but Hitler bluntly informed him that nothing could be done and that Italy would soon fall. As they spoke, Rome was being bombed by Allied air forces, a perfect symbol of the impending collapse of the fascist regime. The Feltre meeting marked a turning point in the relationship between the two dictators. Hitler, frustrated by what he saw as Italian military incompetence, barely concealed his disdain for his ally. Mussolini, who had once been Hitler's mentor and role model, now found himself humiliated, pleading for help from the man who had once admired him. The bombing of Rome during the meeting seemed to underscore Il Duce's helplessness and the futility of his alliance with Germany. Mussolini returned to Italy dejected, aware that his regime's days were numbered. Shortly after, the Grand Council of Fascism signed a petition to remove Mussolini, though they lacked the legal authority to enforce it. On July 25th, the king asked him to resign, informing him that he would be replaced by Pietro Badoglio, but assuring him immunity. Victor Emmanuel III had 200 police officers surround the government palace, and Mussolini was escorted in a Red Cross ambulance to a secure house. Thus, the regime that had dominated Italy for over 2 decades seemingly came to an end. Mussolini's downfall was met with spontaneous celebrations across Italy. In Rome, Milan, Naples, and other cities, jubilant crowds tore down symbols of the fascist regime. Statues of Il Duce were smashed, fascist emblems ripped from public buildings, and Mussolini's portraits burned in the streets. After years of repression, Italians openly expressed their relief and hope for a better future. However, these celebrations would prove premature. Italy's fate, and Mussolini's, still had dark chapters to unfold. The king believed this move would save both the monarchy and his reign, but he was mistaken. After the armistice, Italy plunged into civil war. The king, his family, Badoglio, and government collaborators fled to Apulia under Allied military protection. There they formed an improvised government and declared war on Germany, Italy's former ally. This allowed Germany to invade northern Italy, bringing brutal reprisals against civilians and Italian soldiers who refused to keep fighting alongside the Nazis. Mussolini was first taken to the island of La Maddalena and later to Hotel Campo Imperatore in the Apennines, a remote mountain resort in the Gran Sasso d'Italia, the highest peak of the mountain range. There he was virtually cut off from the outside world, guarded by hundreds of carabinieri. Fearing he would be handed over to the Allies, he attempted to slit his wrists but failed. He had no idea that Hitler was already planning his rescue, determined not to abandon his fascist ally and, more importantly, to establish a puppet government in northern Italy to continue the fight against the Allies. On September 12, 1943, one of the most daring rescue missions of the war took place. In what became known as Operation Oak, Unternehmen Eiche, German commandos, led by SS officer Otto Skorzeny, executed an airborne assault on the mountain complex where Mussolini was being held. Using gliders, German paratroopers stormed the hotel and extracted Mussolini, taking him to Germany to meet Hitler. The entire operation lasted only 4 minutes and ended without bloodshed, thanks to the element of surprise and precise German planning. Mussolini appeared broken when he was brought before Hitler at his headquarters in East Prussia. Exhausted, depressed, and in failing health, he was merely a shadow of the charismatic leader he had once been. However, Hitler had plans for him. In what some interpret as a display of personal loyalty, but which likely had more strategic motivations, Hitler offered Mussolini the chance to establish a new fascist republic in the German-occupied regions of Italy, supported by the Wehrmacht. On September 18th, in a radio address, Mussolini announced the reformation of the fascist party, now renamed the Republican Fascist Party. He declared that he had been betrayed by the monarchy and the bourgeoisie and vowed revenge against those who had abandoned the fascist cause. He also proclaimed his intention to create a new state, one that would remain true to the original ideals of fascism, which he claimed had been corrupted in the later years of his regime. However, his voice lacked the energy and conviction of his earlier speeches. To many who listened to the broadcast, it was clear that this resurrected Mussolini was nothing more than a puppet in Hitler's hands. On September 23, 1943, Mussolini returned to Italy to lead the Italian Social Republic, Repubblica Sociale Italiana, RS1, also known as the Republic of Salo, named after the small town on the shores of Lake Garda, where his administration was based. This German-controlled puppet state could never quell civil unrest, as it faced Allied forces on one front and an increasingly powerful partisan resistance on the other. Only 6 states recognized the RS1 as sovereign, all of them Axis satellites. Even Spain, Portugal, and Vichy France refused to establish diplomatic relations. The Republic of Salo represented a more radical and extreme version of Italian fascism, directly influenced by German Nazism. While the previous regime had maintained some autonomy from Nazi racial ideology, the RS1 fully embraced genocidal anti-Semitism. Jews in RSEY-controlled territory were arrested and deported to German extermination camps. The new fascist militia, the Republican National Guard, actively collaborated with the SS in persecuting Jews and political opponents. The RSI also participated in the war against the partisans, committing numerous atrocities against civilians suspected of supporting the resistance. In 1944, Mussolini suggested to Hitler that he should focus on destroying Britain rather than the Soviet Union, but Hitler refused to take advice from a strategist he considered mediocre. Mussolini wanted to launch an offensive along the Gothic Line, a defensive position in the Apennines. His Alpine divisions won some battles in December 1944, but his army was small compared to the Allies. The situation became desperate in February 1945, when the Allies finally broke through the Gothic Line. Support for Il Duce crumbled, and many military officers secretly attempted to negotiate a truce with the Allies. As the war neared its end, Mussolini's position became increasingly precarious. Allied advances from the south and the expanding territory controlled by the partisan resistance continuously reduced the area under RSI control. People fled en masse to avoid forced conscription, and many soldiers deserted. Mussolini himself seemed increasingly disconnected from reality, alternating between moments of euphoria, when he proposed grand military plans, and periods of deep depression, when he recognized the inevitability of defeat. His final months in power were marked by purges, summary executions, and vengeance against the traitors of July 1943, in a desperate attempt to maintain control over a collapsing regime. The reckoning, the capture and execution of Mussolini. When Germany's defeat became inevitable in the spring of 1945, Mussolini was left with few options. On April 18th, he traveled to Milan for fruitless meetings with anti-fascist leaders, seeking a negotiated exit that could save his life. Cardinal Ildefonso Schuster, Archbishop of Milan, attempted to mediate, but the unconditional surrender terms proposed by the National Liberation Committee were unacceptable to Mussolini, with Allied forces advancing rapidly and partisans controlling much of northern Italy. His window of opportunity for escape was closing quickly. After the failed meeting at the Archbishop's palace, Mussolini decided to flee north with no clear destination, perhaps hoping to reach Switzerland or the last German strongholds in the Alps. Disguised as an SS soldier, he traveled in a German convoy under the command of Luftwaffe Lieutenant Schallmayer. His wife, Rachele, and their young children remained in Como, but he took his lover, Clara Petacci, and her brother, Marcello, who posed as the Spanish consul and his wife. Other fascist leaders, including Alessandro Pavolini and Nicola Bombacci, also joined the group. Mussolini's escape was part of the so-called Pavolini Column, a convoy of vehicles carrying high-ranking fascist officials, their families, and important regime documents. It was a disorganized and desperate group, reflecting the chaotic collapse of Italian fascism. Some members carried large sums of money and jewelry, loot accumulated through years of corruption. Others transported compromising files they hoped to destroy or use as bargaining chips. Most were simply trying to survive the downfall of the regime they had served. The column moved slowly along roads clogged with refugees and retreating German troops, a perfect symbol of the disorderly end of the fascist imperial dream. The convoy was spotted near Dongo at 6:30 a.m. on April 27th by communist partisans of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, led by Urbano Lazzaro, known by his wartime alias Bill. After an initial exchange of gunfire and fearing partisan reinforcements, Schallmayer agreed to negotiate. The partisans allowed the Germans to continue north in exchange for the surrender of all Italians. Around 7 p.m., while checking the documents of those in the convoy, partisan fighter Giuseppe Negri recognized Mussolini and informed Lazzaro. Mussolini attempted to deceive the partisans by pretending to be Lieutenant Tenenete and hiding among German soldiers, but his face was too recognizable despite the military coat and helmet he used as a disguise. When identified, Mussolini reportedly surrendered without resistance, saying, "I am Mussolini. If you hand me over to the Allies, my international prestige will help you secure better peace terms for Italy." It was a pathetic and delusional plea from a man who had lost touch with reality. The partisans, many of whom had lost family members due to his policies, had no intention of turning him over to the Allies. That night, news of Mussolini's arrest reached Milan and was triumphantly announced on the radio by Sandro Pertini, future president of Italy, and then a leader of the National Liberation Committee. With an emotional voice, Pertini declared, "The executioner has fallen." He also announced the committee's decision that Mussolini should be executed like a rabid dog. This would not be an act of personal vengeance, Pertini insisted, but an act of revolutionary justice necessary to definitively close the chapter of fascism in Italy. On the morning of April 28th, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were taken to a farmhouse in Dongo. A group of communist partisans arrived from Milan with orders to execute them immediately without trial or legal formalities. The order came from the partisan high command in Milan, which feared that the Allies or moderate resistance leaders might insist on a formal trial, risking Mussolini escaping the ultimate punishment. For the communist resistance leaders, only the dictator's death could guarantee that fascism would never return. The prisoners were placed in a Fiat 1100 and driven to the village of Giulino di Mezzegra, where they would be executed. The partisans led Mussolini and Petacci to the entrance of Villa Belmonte, a residence overlooking Lake Como. Walter Audicio, a partisan commander known by his alias Colonel Valerio, ordered them to step out of the vehicle. Il Duce, dressed in a dark overcoat, appeared to have accepted his fate. Petacci, visibly terrified, clung to his arm, refusing to let go even in her final moments. Audicio pulled out an Italian-made MAS 38 submachine gun. Without ceremony, he announced, "By order of the National Liberation Committee, I have come to execute the sentence against Benito Mussolini." According to witnesses, Mussolini opened his coat, exposing his chest, and exclaimed, "Shoot me in the chest!" Audicio aimed, but at the critical moment the gun jammed, one last moment of dramatic tension in the dictator's life. In those seconds of confusion, Clara Petacci threw herself in front of Mussolini in a final act of devotion, embracing him while screaming, "You cannot kill him!" Audicio quickly grabbed an MP-40 submachine gun from a fellow partisan and fired a burst that struck them both. Petacci fell first, followed by Mussolini, collapsing as blood soaked his uniform. Odissio approached the fallen body and fired 2 more shots, one to the heart and one to the head, to ensure the dictator was truly dead. The clock read 4:10 p.m. The man who had ruled Italy with an iron fist for over 2 decades now lay lifeless on a dusty rural road, his life ended by the same violence that had defined his regime. The bodies were thrown into the back of a truck and taken to Milan. Along the way, no one was allowed near the corpses until they arrived at Piazzale Loreto on April 29th. This location was not chosen at random. Months earlier, the fascists had displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans there, forcing the people of Milan to witness the macabre spectacle as a warning to those who opposed the regime. Now, in an act of poetic justice, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and other executed fascist leaders would be displayed in the same place. What followed was a scene of collective vengeance that reflected the intensity of the suffering fascism had inflicted on Italy. The bodies were unloaded and thrown onto the ground in front of an Esso gas station. An enraged crowd quickly gathered, growing from hundreds to thousands as word spread. Ordinary citizens, concentration camp survivors, relatives of victims and partisans all joined in a public act of national catharsis. The corpses were desecrated in a way that reflected the accumulated rage of years of oppression. People spat on, kicked, and struck the bodies. Some fired shots at them even though they were already dead. One woman, whose son had been killed by the fascists, fired 5 shots into Mussolini's body, one for each of her lost children. Others threw garbage onto the corpses, physically manifesting their contempt for those who had oppressed them for so long. Finally, the partisans decided to hang the bodies upside down from the metal beams of the gas station, a traditional Italian method of marking traitors. Mussolini and Petacci were hoisted up by ropes tied to their ankles, along with the corpses of other fascist leaders, including Starace, Pavolini, and Bombacci. To increase the humiliation, the bodies were hung very close together, creating a grotesque image that many compared to a slaughterhouse. The sight of these bodies hanging upside down, their clothing torn and bloodied, would become one of the most powerful symbols of the fall of fascism in Italy and one of the most shocking photographs of the 20th century. Mussolini's corpse was so disfigured that his face, once omnipresent in schoolbooks and flags, was nearly unrecognizable. The bodies remained hanging for hours, exposed to the gaze of thousands of Milanese who passed by the scene, until they were finally taken down and moved to anonymous graves in Milan's Musocco cemetery. The public display of the bodies and the posthumous violence have been interpreted in different ways by historians and commentators. For some, it was a necessary act of collective purification, a ritual exorcism of fascism's demons. For others, it was a troubling expression of the same brutality that had characterized the fascist regime, showing how deeply political violence had permeated Italian society. What is indisputable is that the images of Mussolini hanging upside down in Piazzale Loreto became a powerful visual reminder of the fate that awaits tyrants. But Mussolini's story did not end there. On April 22, 1946, the Duce's remains were stolen from the cemetery by neo-fascists led by Domenico Lecisi, an act that demonstrated that even in death, Mussolini remained a deeply polarizing political symbol. The thieves, motivated by ideological devotion, believed it was unworthy for their leader to lie in an unmarked grave. For 113 days, the body's whereabouts remained a mystery, capturing both national and international attention until authorities finally recovered it. It had been moved from place to place before being hidden in the Certosa di Pavia, inside a small box labeled Guidi. After being returned to the family, Mussolini's body was kept in secret for over 10 years until 1957, when the Italian government finally allowed it to be moved to a crypt in his hometown of Predappio. The tomb immediately became a pilgrimage site for neo-fascists who continue to visit, especially on the anniversaries of his birth and death. Despite ongoing controversies and debates over whether such commemorations should be allowed, the tomb remains accessible to the public, attracting around 100,000 visitors annually, many of them nostalgic admirers of the fascist regime. In 1971, a bomb exploded in the crypt, causing damage but leaving the tombs intact, an attack that showed that the political passions stirred by Mussolini were still alive decades after his death. The bombing, attributed to far-left militants, was condemned by both the government and most Italians, regardless of their political views. By then, Italy had developed a widespread consensus that political violence from any side should be rejected. However, Mussolini's legacy continued to be a divisive issue in Italian politics. On April 29, 1945, Adolf Hitler was informed of Mussolini's death. Hermann Göring later testified at Nuremberg that he and Hitler had seen the photographs of Mussolini hanging upside down during their last meeting. The image of his former ally and early role model suffering such a humiliating fate must have deeply affected Hitler, reinforcing his determination never to be captured alive. The next day, Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, choosing death by his own hand rather than the public and degrading fate that had befallen the Italian Duce. The Bloody Legacy: Reflections on the Fascist Dictatorship. Mussolini perpetrated some of the bloodiest crimes among the European dictators of the 20th century. Under his command, hundreds of thousands were massacred, including Jews, Africans, and Italian citizens. His regime left deep scars on Italy and its occupied territories. Italian fascism established an authoritarian model that would be imitated worldwide, based on the subordination of the individual to the state under the slogan, "Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state." In response, the 1948 Republican Constitution of Italy explicitly banned the reorganization of the fascist party and established a parliamentary democracy with decentralized power. In Africa, Italian colonies suffered decades of exploitation, racial discrimination, and violent repression. The massacres in Ethiopia and Libya, including the use of chemical weapons and deliberate famines, foreshadowed some of the worst atrocities of World War II. Similarly, fascist bombings in Spain targeting civilian populations set a precedent for tactics that would be extensively used during the war. The regime left a contradictory cultural legacy. While it undertook ambitious infrastructure projects that benefited Italy, censorship and the persecution of intellectuals led to significant cultural impoverishment, forcing many of the country's best artists and academics into exile or silence. Mussolini's trajectory serves as a warning about how democracies can transform into dictatorships. Unlike Hitler, Mussolini initially came to power through quasi-legal means, exploiting public discontent and fear of communism. He gradually dismantled democratic institutions until he had established total control. After the war, there was a tendency to minimize Italy's culpability through the myth of the good Italian, suggesting that Italians were reluctant fascists who showed humanity even during the war. Recent historical research has challenged this narrative, thoroughly documenting the crimes of fascist colonialism. The images of Mussolini and Petacci hanging upside down in Piazzale Loreto have become iconic in 20th century history. For a dictator who had built an image of strength and virility, this death represented the ultimate humiliation, a visual reminder of the fate that awaits those who abuse power. 75 years later, Mussolini's figure remains controversial in Italy. While the majority rejects fascism, a minority continues to venerate his memory, with neo-fascist groups like Casapound and Forza Nuova keeping some of his ideas alive. His tomb in Predappio continues to attract far-right pilgrims. Perhaps Mussolini's most enduring legacy is the opposite of what he intended. Not an imperial revival, but a lasting warning about the dangers of authoritarianism and the fragility of democratic institutions in the face of charismatic demagogues.